Which lens is best for wildlife photography? A 150 to 600mm zoom lens or a 600mm prime lens? In this video, I pick a clear winner in the Kgalagadi Transfrontier Park. Hi, I'm Phileas Steyn and I'm the safari expert. And earlier this year, I was lucky enough to spend 2 unforgettable weeks in an uncharacteristically lush Kgalagadi Transfrontier Park. My friend Enrol joined me, and because we both have full-frame Canon 5D Mark IV cameras with the 100 to 400mm Mark II zoom lenses, I was a little bit worried that we might feel a little bit short when it comes to focal length. So I decided to rent a Tamron 150 to 600mm G2 zoom lens, as well as a Canon 600mm f4 Mark I prime lens from Outdoor Photo in Pretoria. Not only to give us that extra reach, but also to compare 2 of the most popular lenses in the Kgalagadi. And just to clarify, for the purposes of this comparison, you can easily substitute the Tamron 150 to 600mm G2 lens for the Sigma 150 to 600mm sport lens. Outdoor Photo just didn't have one in their rental pool at that stage. What I do have to say though is that I'm not a fan of both the Tamron and the Sigma entry-level versions of these 2 lenses. In other words, the cheaper 150 to 600mm lenses. And that's why I rented the Tamron 150 to 600 G2 lens. Before I dive into the comparison of the 2 lenses, remember that I always place any important links and information in the description below, including where you can order the best book about the Kalahari called Kgalagadi Self-Drive, Routes, Roads and Ratings online. So remember to go and check it out at the end of the video. Right, I decided to consider 5 key aspects when I compared the Tamron 150 to 600mm G2 zoom lens with the Canon 600mm f4 prime lens, and whichever one outperformed the other scores a point. That way we'll hopefully end up with a winner, and I decided to leave the most important comparisons for last, so make sure you watch to the end. And I'd love to know whether you agree with my verdict or not. So the first thing I compared was size and weight. In other words, how easy or difficult was it to handle the lens while self-driving in the Kgalagadi? Let's start with the 600mm prime lens. This lens is gigantic and it didn't even fit on the passenger seat next to me. Because I was driving for most of the trip, I actually gave it to Owen and said, you use it for the rest of the trip. It's very large and heavy and difficult to move around in the vehicle. This version 1 of the lens weighs a whopping 5.4 kilograms, and even the newest version, the version 3, still weighs 3 kilograms. Compare that with the Tamron 150 to 600mm G2 zoom lens, which weighs only 2 kilograms, making it substantially easier to maneuver around in the vehicle. The 150 to 600 is also small enough to balance on even a small beanbag, while I would hesitate to take my hands off the 600 prime even on a large beanbag. The first point then goes to the 150 to 600mm lens for being so much smaller and lighter than the 600mm prime. It would be irresponsible not to compare the durability of the 2 lenses, especially if you're considering buying one for your trips to remote destinations like the Kgalagadi, where your equipment will be tested to the limit in the heat and the dust. Part of the reason the 600mm prime is so heavy is because it's built like a tank, and it can easily withstand even the harshest of elements out in the field, together with the odd bump against a car window. The 150 to 600, however, feels a lot more vulnerable. I've got no doubt that the plastic sun hood will break if you bump it too hard, and the rubber zoom ring has a tendency to stretch a little bit when it's used a lot in the heat. It's not surprising then that the 600mm f4 prime lens draws level after 2 rounds. Moving away a little from the Kgalagadi specifically, I decided to add price to the comparison in round 3, because it's arguably the most significant of all. You see, as I'm sitting here right now, I can buy the Tamron 150 to 600mm G2 zoom lens for 24,595 Rand. Its Sigma counterpart, the 150 to 600mm sport lens, is only fractionally more expensive at 28,795 Rand. On the flip side, most camera shops don't stock the Mark I or Mark II Canon 600mm prime lenses anymore. So if you're looking to buy new, the Mark III will cost you a whopping 243,995 Rand. That's nearly 10 times more than the 150 to 600mm zoom lens. And even if you're happy to buy secondhand, the Mark II of the 600mm prime is probably still going to cost around 100,000 Rand, and even the old Mark I will probably still cost you around 50,000 Rand. You can decide for yourself whether spending that much money on a lens is worth it after you've considered round 4 and round 5, where I compare the quality and versatility of the lenses. But one option that you should seriously consider when you go to the Kgalagadi is renting a lens. At the moment, you can rent a Tamron 150 to 600mm G2 zoom lens for only 500 Rand a day, and the Canon 600mm f4 Mark I, like Owen used, for only 720 Rand a day. Throw in an extra 130 Rand a day and you'll get a Mark II. These rental prices will obviously change over time, but it's always going to be substantially cheaper than buying it. And I know some of you are still going to say, but geez, Valia, that's expensive. But believe me, if you're only going to use it for 2 or 3 weeks a year, renting makes a lot more sense than buying, especially if you consider insurance. I had excellent service at Outdoor Photo and I can highly recommend them. I've placed a link to their rental department in the description below. Now, when it comes to price and the value for your precious money, I have to give the point to the Tamron 150 to 600mm G2 zoom lens, which now leads the Canon 600mm f4 prime 2-1. I know for some the next aspect that I compared will be the decider, irrespective of the final score, and that's quality. I don't think anybody would have expected the 150 to 600mm zoom lens to outperform the 600mm prime when it comes to quality. But just how much better is that large f4 lens? When it comes to sharpness, there's just no beating it. So we just found a young Gabar goshawk here at Sameflowing Waterhole, and it was right next to us, and Owen was able to get some amazing photographs with the 600 prime. Check this out.
That is pin sharp.
Just look at the sharpness of this young goshawk's feathers, or the fur on this male leopard's face, especially when you zoom in. But it's in low light that the 600mm prime really outshined the smaller zoom lens. Just look at this incredible sharpness of this mother cheetah and her cub photographed on a dark, rainy morning. The Tamron 150 to 600mm G2 zoom lens had mixed results when it came to sharpness. Sometimes when the light was good, my images were surprisingly sharp, like with this lion. But other times when the light wasn't that good, it seemed a little bit soft for my liking. Even in sunny conditions, some of my photos came out a little bit soft with the zoom lens. Before we pick an obvious winner, let's just quickly look at depth of field as well. I must admit that I was pleasantly surprised at the blurriness of the background of the images I took with the zoom lens at 600mm wide open. As you can see, it's only slightly less blurred than those taken with the 600mm prime lens. The 600mm prime lens ties the scores at 2-all after taking quality into consideration. But I really have to say that having never used one before, I was really impressed with the quality of my photos when I used the Tamron 150 to 600mm G2 zoom lens, especially if you consider how much cheaper it is than the prime lens. And like I said before, you will not get this level of sharpness if you use the cheaper entry-level Tamron and Sigma zoom lenses. So it all comes down to the final round where I compared what I thought was even more important than quality, especially if you consider the Kgalagadi, and that is focal length. Another word I like to use is versatility. You see, you can easily be fooled into thinking that the long focal length of the 600 prime is an advantage to get closer to the birds and the animals, especially in an open habitat like the Kgalagadi. But more often than not, it's actually a disadvantage simply because you can't zoom out. Remember, in most national parks, you're not allowed to off-road, and that makes it very difficult to park further away from your subject, at least if you want to photograph it from a specific angle. Take this sighting of 2 male lions playing as an example. When they were the ideal distance from us, the 600mm prime worked perfectly, but as soon as they moved closer to us, parts of their body parts were cut off by the edge of the frame. Remember that lion portrait we took early one morning? While Owen could only take portraits with the 600mm prime, I had the luxury of zooming out with the 150 to 600mm lens to capture the lion in its environment. In fact, that's my favorite feature of this specific lens. The ability to not only take stunning close-ups, but also to zoom out and photograph the Kalahari creatures in the stunning environment that they call home. So with a clear conscience, I declare the Tamron 150-600mm G2 zoom lens victorious over the Canon 600mm f4 Mark I prime lens in this Kgalagadi face-off. Having these two longer lenses in the Kgalagadi was a real treat, and I cannot recommend renting at least one of these from a place like Outperforms highly enough. And of course, if you're in the market of actually buying one, there's no better place to go than Outperforms. So remember to go and check out those links in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up below, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what you would have scored these two lenses. Also take a moment to check out some of my other videos about the Kgalagadi.